This is the Champion of Democracy, Element 1, about dollar diplomacy and initial neutrality in World War I. Okay, to start with, what is dollar diplomacy? Well, it was the brainchild of William Howard Taft, President of the United States from 1909 to 1913, the guy who followed Theodore Roosevelt and came before Woodrow Wilson. Now, President Taft wanted American business to invest surplus capital in areas of strategic concern to the United States, specifically the Far East and Central America. The idea was to invest in these areas before foreign powers could, just to get a foothold there and expand the market for U.S. goods. To start with, Chinese Manchuria was a primary focus. Japan and Russia controlled the railroads there, which could have created a problem for the United States. So in 1909, the U.S. attempted to buy the railroads and turn them over to China. But Japan and Russia refused, and Taft looked ridiculous in the process. So, all in all, it didn't seem like dollar diplomacy was going to work in Asia. But the U.S. was also focused on Central America, and that's where dollar diplomacy seemed to make its biggest strides. The U.S. had a solid foothold in most of the Caribbean already. One newspaper was referring to the Caribbean as Lake Yankee. But they didn't really have any influence in Haiti or Honduras. Fearing foreign influence and wanting to live up to the ideals of the old Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. invested heavily in Haiti and Honduras. In essence, they would invest there and then still uphold the Monroe Doctrine's ideals of keeping Europe out of Western Hemisphere interaction and business. This, of course, led to increased troop involvements in the Caribbean, as we now had interest to protect there. If you take a look at this chart, you'll see that U.S. Marines eventually found themselves in Nicaragua in 1912. They'd stay there until 1925. And other American forces ended up in Cuba, Honduras, and the Dominican Republic as well. But when Taft left office in 1913, new President Woodrow Wilson took the exact opposite approach. Wilson's foreign policy was based on non-aggression. Now, if you take a look at this chart here, we're going to see the foreign policy ideals of the presidents from 1901 pretty much all the way up to 1920. We start here with Teddy Roosevelt, who was president from 1901 to 1909. Now, Teddy Roosevelt followed what he called the big stick policy. It was the idea of walking softly but carrying a big stick in the Caribbean. This is emphasized by the Roosevelt Corollary, where we paid off all of Latin America's debts to Europe and then basically said, you belong to us, which essentially gave us the right to police Latin America and use force to protect our interests there. Well, Teddy Roosevelt was gone by 1909 as President of the United States, and he was followed by William Howard Taft, and we just talked about the dollar diplomacy of his approach, guaranteeing loans made by American business people to foreign governments. The idea was that we'd get an economic foothold there. But Wilson, who took over in 1913 and would be president until 1921, hated imperialism. He hated Teddy Roosevelt's big stick policies, and he hated Taft's dollar diplomacy. So he wanted to go in the exact opposite direction. First, Wilson proclaimed that the United States would no longer offer special support to American investors in Latin America and China. American bankers pulled out of a six-nation loan to China the next day. Wilson then persuaded Congress to repeal the Panama Canal Tolls Act of 1914, which had exempted the U.S. from paying tolls when they went through the Panama Canal. And then Wilson got Congress to pass the Jones Act of 1916, which granted the Philippines independence as soon as a stable government could be established there, something that would happen by the end of World War II in 1945. But however reluctant, non-aggressive, and isolationist that Wilson was, he couldn't stay out of everything. Down in Haiti, the Haitians literally tore their president to pieces in 1915. Not politically, literally. And Wilson had to send Marines to protect American interests in Haiti there as basically civil war broke out for a time being. Well, the Marines would stay there for 19 years, supervising Haitian finances and the police. The Marines were also sent to shut down problems in the Dominican Republic. They stayed there for 8 years. And eventually, Wilson purchased the Virgin Islands from Denmark in 1917. So, as much as he wanted to stay out of things, he really couldn't. At least, not in the Caribbean. Wilson was also experiencing problems in Mexico during this time as well. U.S. investors had sunk $1 billion into Mexican oil, railroads, and mines by 1913 as a part of Taft's dollar diplomacy approach. U.S. investors got rich. The Mexican people, they stayed pretty poor. Now, revolution in Mexico had not been a new thing. Mexican revolutions against the government had started becoming common at the beginning of the 1900s. In 1913, they had a revolutionary president, but he was murdered and replaced by General Victoriano Huerta. Huerta's election led to mass migrations out of Mexico, 1 million of whom went to the United States. Many in America called for a U.S. intervention in Mexico to protect American interests there. These people were led by the publisher William Randolph Hearst, he of the old yellow journalism days during the Spanish-American War, who, if you remember, has a castle. His family still has a castle to this day just south of San Francisco overlooking the Pacific. Well, he had a big interest in Mexico as well. He owned a ranch down there that was larger than the state of Rhode Island. This is a picture of it right here, and obviously it's not totally in the whole frame, but it's spread out over lots and lots of acres. More acres than the state of Rhode Island. Wilson listened to him, but he flatly refused to get involved down there. However, what he did do, starting in 1914, was allow Huerta's biggest rivals, this guy Venustiano Carranza, and Francisco Villa, who you might know better as Pancho Villa, to have U.S. weapons. So Wilson is basically trying to stay out, but things aren't getting any easier for him down there in Mexico. The Tampico Incident of 1914 takes place, where American soldiers were arrested by Mexican officials at the seaport of Tampico. Now, the Mexican government quickly released the men and apologized, but the American admiral was insulted. He demanded that the Mexicans salute them on the way out. If you'll notice at the top of the paper here, the headline says that Huerta must salute or the Atlantic Fleet will seize Tampico and Veracruz. Wilson, again, really wants to be non-aggressive, but he reluctantly orders the Navy to blockade the ports in Tampico to block out a shipment of German arms to Huerta. Mexicans were very upset with the United States for this. Even Carranza, who had been getting arms from Wilson in the United States to go against Huerta. Eventually, the Huerta regime collapsed, but it was replaced by Carranza as president, who was still upset with the United States over the blockade. This was not good for relations, so Wilson had no choice but to reluctantly support Carranza in everything he was doing in Mexico. Meanwhile, Pancho Villa, who was kind of like a Mexican Robin Hood at this point and cheered on by the peasants in Mexico, was now Carranza's rival and wanted the U.S. to stop supporting him. In 1916, Pancho Villa's men murdered 16 American engineers on a train in northern Mexico, then crossed the U.S. border, killing 19 more people. U.S. General John J. Pershing was ordered to hunt down Pancho Villa and tracked him throughout Mexico. Pershing's troops got into some skirmishes when they got down there and did well, and it seemed to be they were closing in on Pancho Villa, but it was taking a little bit too long, and looming problems in World War I, which had started in 1914, forced the U.S. to leave Mexico in 1917, having never captured Villa. They appeared to have some bigger fish to fry because they were about to go over to Europe to fight in the Great War. But at this point, we have to back up a step because starting in 1914, Wilson, again, who's very non-aggressive and very isolationist in his foreign policy, was doing everything he could to be neutral for the first 3 years of the Great War of Europe. Now, how did this whole mess start in the first place? Well, Franz Ferdinand, who was heir to the throne in Austria-Hungary, was murdered by a Serbian patriot in 1914. Now, Austria-Hungary was right here, and Serbia was right here. And the guy who shot Franz Ferdinand was named Gavrilo Princip. He was a Serbian patriot who was afraid that once Franz Ferdinand ascended to the throne of Austria-Hungary, that they would just wipe out this map line and just swallow up Serbia and make it part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Well, as a result, a series of pre-war alliances kick in. You can see them over on the side here. The dual alliance, the triple alliance, all these things had been done before the war, but how many alliances are we talking about? Well, it turns out quite a few. Starting with the dual alliance in 1879, there were a lot of different agreements that European nations had made with each other. And by the time you get to 1914, everybody's already locked into alliances with each other against other nations in Europe. So all you really needed was one spark to set this whole thing off, and you were going to end up in a war. And just like that, the Great War of Europe, also known as World War I, was off and running, with alliances already having been established, in some cases decades before this thing even got started. Now, it's a classic lesson. If you take a look at the Great War of Europe, it's a classic lesson on how one incident can turn into something much bigger than you ever thought and much worse. The U.S., meanwhile, as evidenced by this political cartoon here, was grateful for two large oceans and George Washington's suggestion of not having foreign alliances. They felt like they had a nice big buffer zone with the Atlantic Ocean on one side over here and the Pacific Ocean on the other side over here, fully protected from what was going on in Europe at that time. It wouldn't last for long. Now, the two distinct sides in the Great War of Europe were the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. The Central Powers were called that because they ran right through the center of Europe and included Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey right here. And they were matched up in the war against the Allies, which included Britain, France, Russia, and eventually Italy as well. Now, both sides in the war, the Central Powers and the Allied Powers, tried to get the U.S. to join them. But Wilson stayed firmly neutral and isolationist. He wanted absolutely no part of this. However, the U.S. economy needed to improve, and increasing anti-German sentiment was swelling up in the United States. So we began selling munitions to the Allies. Germany responded by setting up a naval blockade around Britain and France, as you can see here on the map, causing U-boat or Untersee boats, in other words, submarines, to sink ships carrying munitions designed for the Allied powers. However, they promised not to sink neutral boats, per U.S. warnings, who had told Germany, if you do sink neutral boats, things could end up badly for you. We might get involved. But in 1915, the Germans sunk a British ship called the Lusitania, which was carrying 128 Americans. The U.S. was extremely upset, and the Germans claimed that it was a mistake. Then, in 1916, they sank a French ship called the Sussex, which also had Americans on it as well. Wilson said that if it happens again, he'd consider war, and the Germans promised to alter their naval and submarine policy of unrestricted sub-warfare and stop the sinking of non-military ships. The pledge said that they would search merchant ships and sink them only if they had contained contraband, and only after safe passage had been provided for the crew and the passengers. So where does that leave us in Germany? Well, stay tuned for Element 2. Thanks for listening.